On the Isle of Lewis, standing near the edge of a great cliff, is the ruins of a house, and although the house is not as ancient as many in Scotland, its short existence is filled with tales of odd happenings and strange occurrences. This is the history and haunting of Dune Tower. At the beginning of the 20th century, a young Brethren preacher and his wife returned to the Isle of Lewis from their years studying in America. The pair decided to build a church meeting hall on the moors of Cellar Head, a few miles south from the village of Lionel. They hoped to bring their new religious knowledge to the remote island and would conduct services from the hall. After some time, the pair knew that on the Cellar Head in Lewis was where they were destined to stay and preach. To answer this calling, the preacher decided to build a house, but did not want to live near the village. Instead, he preferred to be closer to the preaching hall. So for many days, the man and his new flock would scour the land at Cellar Head to find a firm bed to build upon. The local men knew of only one place such a house could be built, an area by the edge of the cliff, once known to be the location of a very old Iron Age watchtower and gravesite that many people now believe was of Scandinavian origin. It was precisely on that spot the preacher decided to build his home. In fact, many people say that rocks and bricks from the old watchtower were used in the creation of the preacher's house. The old Gaelic name for the tower became the name for the house, and it was in this way Dune Tower was built. The coming years were very good to the preacher and his family. Hundreds of parishioners would come to the meeting hall every day for songs and prayer. The trawlermen of Buchan were said to never miss a Sunday service. Rumour spread all over the island of the new preacher. Many were now calling him a seer, as it would seem to the parishioners that the man was wise beyond his years and had great knowledge of all things. This drove more and more islanders to visit the hall, and it is told that the sound of singers and the melody of the harmonium could be heard all over the moor. But none of the singers were ever willing to return to the seer's house. Those in the surrounding villages thought the place to be eerie or unnatural. Rumours and tales surrounded the local area of ghostly figures scouring the Cellar Head. Some believed these haunting phantoms to be the lost spirits of men who had died while hunting birds on the cliff near Dune Tower. Others thought them to be the vengeful souls of the Iron Age warriors, now disturbed from their slumber by the building of Dune Tower. Many of the fishermen in the area told stories of how there were a mass of tunnels beneath the Dune Tower, where hundreds of ancient graves could be found. Apparently, these tunnels were once used by pirates and smugglers, until even they feared the ghosts of the past. It was believed that the power and the piety of the preacher and his wife were the only reason they remained safe from the hunting spectres. These superstitions and fears show the general attitude of the locals towards Dune Tower. But despite these fears, the preacher and his wife lived in the house for over 20 years. Eventually, the now old seer sold his cliffside house, and it is here the real tale begins. The new owner took charge of the property sometime in 1927. It was his wish to live in the house as it had some of the most stunning views on the island. The owner had many friends, and he desired that they too should see the wild views from Dune Tower. To accommodate his visitors, some renovations were needed. The owner committed 2 local joiners to begin the work just after the New Year celebrations. Due to the isolated nature of the cliffside home, It was determined that the joiners, along with a housekeeper, would live in the property as they worked through the week and would only return home for the weekend. The joiners were somewhat apprehensive, as they knew well the old tales of Dune Tower, but the pay was good and the work was not easy to come by at that time. So on a Monday morning, the pair headed to the old seer's house to begin the renovation. For the first few days, all went well. The men worked hard throughout the day, and the housekeeper attended to them by making meals and washing clothes. But on one night, the 3 temporary residents were suddenly awoken by 3 loud knocks at the front door. The joiners, in some panic, pulled themselves from bed and went to greet the untimely visitor. But upon opening the door, not a soul was to be found. The pair, with lighted lamps, walked out into the cold night, but all they could hear was the howling of the wind and the crashing of the sea many feet below. Quickly their search ended, and as the moonlight glistened off the frost-covered fields, the men returned to their beds, but none would sleep that night. A few nights later, the joiner's sleep was again disturbed, this time by a great clatter, which sounded like a bolt had fallen through the roof of the house and landed heavily on the concrete floor. Again, the men woke with a start and spent the rest of the night searching in vain for the origin of the sound. By the time the weekend came, all 3 of Dune Tower's residents were more than ready to return home. The joiners would relate their eerie and unsettling experience at the house to their friends and neighbours that weekend. They told of the sounds in the night and that neither man particularly wanted to return for the next week. Nevertheless, come Monday morning, the 2 men and the housekeeper made their return to Dune Tower. This week was going well. It was already Wednesday, and no more strange occurrences had happened. Then came Thursday morning. At around 4 a.m, an immense bang sounded, as though a heavy shell had been discharged from an entrenched artillery cannon at the rear of the house. The whole cliff seemed to quake as the terrified joiners leapt out of bed and in sheer panic ran from the house out into the snow in only but their sleepwear. They called to the woman, but it seemed that the blast caused her to faint, and it wasn't until the freezing men gained the courage to re-enter the house that they found her on the bedroom floor. Damning the rest of the work, the 3 dressed themselves and headed home. Each of the 3 wished that the work was done and that never again would they have to see Dune Tower. But come the following Monday, the joiners and the housekeeper returned apprehensively once more. This time the men were doubly intent on finishing the work before Friday, so that they would need never return. The pair made good time, and by Thursday there was only little left to do. But that evening would be the most terrifying yet. At around 11 p.m, the housekeeper was heading out to fetch water for the morning, but when the woman pulled open the door, she found herself standing face to face with a decaying spectre. Before her, hanging freely in the air, was the figure of a man that she knew had been dead for 6 years. The sinister face of the dead man began to float closer to the woman. Suddenly she leapt backwards and slammed the door on the hideous wraith. Collapsing on the other side, the woman grabbed her cross and begged the Lord to deliver her from evil as the icy cold blackness overcame her. After an hour or so of waiting, the 2 men wondered what was taking the housekeeper so long, so the pair went to check on her. It is then when they found the poor woman laying unconscious by the door. When the housekeeper awoke, she began her frightful tale and would not stop shaking the whole time. At the first light of day, the woman left the house and headed for home. The joiners, on the other hand, returned to work and laboured as none had before them. By midday the renovations were complete, and the joiners fled the evil house, never to return again to Dune Tower. Since that day, there has been no recorded ghostly happenings in the house, but we do know that in 1937, John Wilson Dougal, an amateur geologist, would spend the night in Dune Tower while researching the surrounding rocks. At that time, 10 years after our story, the cliffside house stood abandoned and uncared for. As the years continued, Dune Tower would turn to ruins and would become a place of pilgrimage for ghost hunters, archaeologists, and those like myself who just want to see the remains of a place once called the loneliest house in Scotland. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to all the people who support me on Patreon. Slán Siva.